Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is something out there, older than almost anything you can name in this universe, older than the Imperium of man in all its ancient and terrible glory, older than the Elder at the absolute height of their civilization, back when they were gods walking among planets they had shaped to their own specifications. Older, some scholars would argue with good reason, than the very concept of organized warfare as any species currently living in the Milky Way galaxy has ever understood it. It has no name that belongs to it alone, because names are a luxury that individuals grant themselves. And this thing, this creature, this idea given flesh, has never truly been an individual in the way that you or I understand individuality. It is a piece of something vast, something so enormous and so old, and so alien in its fundamental nature, that even approaching a full description of it requires you to set aside the comfortable frameworks through which you normally understand intelligence and will and purpose. It is a piece of the great devourer, the most complete predator the universe has ever produced. And it is the most powerful, most experienced, most strategically sophisticated single organism that predator has ever birthed. To the Imperium of man, the latest interstellar civilization to find itself in the sights of this ancient and hungry darkness, it carries a name that sounds almost too clean, too simple, for the depth of horror it represents. They call it the Swarmlord. And before we go any further, before we begin the long and detailed journey through everything this creature is, and everything it has done, and everything it represents as a threat to the continued existence of life in this galaxy, I want you to spend just a moment with that name. Really sit with it. Swarmlord. It sounds like a title, and in one sense, that is exactly what it is. A classification, a designation, the closest approximation in any language of the Imperium of man to what this thing actually does within the hierarchy of the Great Devourer. But it is also a warning threaded into the syllables for anyone with the knowledge to hear it. Because when the Swarmlord walks onto a battlefield, empires end. When it directs the swarm, civilizations stop breathing. Worlds go dark and silent, not from war in any conventional sense, but because every last molecule of biomass on their surfaces has been consumed, absorbed, recycled into the endless biological hunger of a species that has been eating its way across the stars for longer than anyone in this galaxy can comfortably measure. We are going to spend a long, unhurried time together today. We are going to pull this creature apart from its deepest nature, from the strange philosophy of what it actually is, and the almost biological poetry of how it exists, all the way through to the specific battles that have cemented its reputation as the most dangerous individual organism the Tyranid hive mind can deploy. We will walk through the frozen plains of Macragge, through the sun-scorched ruins of Baal, through the outer fringe where the Tau discovered that optimism and superior ranged firepower are not by themselves sufficient to account for what they were facing. We are going to look at the nature of immortality when it is not a gift, but a mechanism. And we are going to think seriously about what it means that something has been growing more capable with every passing death for millions upon millions of years. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of whatever your day has brought with it set itself aside for a while. Because this is a story that began before humanity looked up at the night sky and first felt the twin pulls of wonder and dread, and it is not yet finished. And the thing at the center of it, patient, ancient, and always hungry, is still out there, ill. To understand the Swarmlord at anything beyond the most surface level, you first have to understand what gave birth to it. You have to understand the hive mind itself. And the hive mind is one of those ideas that presents a deceptive simplicity on first encounter, and becomes genuinely stranger, more unsettling, and more philosophically difficult the longer you sit with what it actually implies. The Tyranids are not a species in the way that most species you have encountered in this setting are species. They are not a collection of beings who happen to share a common biology and a common homeworld and have organized themselves into a collective power through the usual mechanisms of history and culture and politics. They are something categorically different. He is something that does not fit neatly into the frameworks we normally use to understand civilization and intelligence and purpose. They are more like a single organism, so vast that it requires millions of separate biological bodies just to manage the logistics of its own existence across interstellar distances. Every termagant skittering across a devastated battlefield on barbed legs, every hormigaunt bounding through rubble with the fluid grace of something evolved for a single brutal purpose. Every carnifex standing in the middle of what was an armored column and shrugging off the wreckage. All of these creatures are, in the most meaningful biological sense, cells, neurons, individual components of a mind so enormous that no single body could contain it. That mind is the hive mind, and the law is very careful, as across multiple codices and supplement texts, to establish that the hive mind is not a consciousness in the way that you and I have consciousness. It is not a singular intelligence sitting somewhere in a comfortable command structure, processing information and issuing orders down a chain of authority. The hive mind is described across the official law as a grand agglomeration, a gestalt entity created from the combined psychic weight of untold billions of Tyranid organisms distributed across the galaxy. It is an intelligence that did not arise from a single brain, designed by evolution to think individual thoughts, but from the collective psychic resonance of an entire species operating in constant synaptic communion, in each organism adding its sensory data and its biological state to the vast sum of a consciousness that is everywhere. The swarm exists simultaneously. It does not sleep. It does not experience doubt in any way recognizable to a mortal mind. It does not feel the exhaustion of long campaigns or the grief of significant losses. It processes perpetually and with the patience of something that experiences time on a fundamentally different scale than anything with a normal lifespan. And it adapts, and it hungers, and it directs. The hunger is not an emotion superimposed on an otherwise rational entity. The hunger is the entity. It is what the hive mind is, expressed at every level of its existence, from the microscopic organisms that break down the last traces of biomass in a consumed world's soil, all the way up to the impossibly large fleet mind that coordinates the advance of a hive fleet across a sector. What makes this relevant to everything we're going to discuss today is the mechanism through which this vast consciousness reaches down into the material reality of its swarms and actually commands them. Because the hive mind cannot maintain direct, individual contact with every termagant on every battlefield, across every system, it is simultaneously consuming. The sheer scale of the operation makes that logistically impossible, even for an intelligence of its magnitude. The galaxy is enormous. Hive fleets span solar systems, but the number of individual organisms involved in any major Tyranid campaign runs into numbers that overwhelm even the most patient attempts at quantification. So the hive mind works through intermediaries, a cascading network of increasingly powerful and increasingly intelligent creatures that each serve as relay points, amplifiers, and tactical commanders for the swarm below them in the hierarchy. These creatures are called synapse creatures, and they are, if you want a single phrase that captures their role, the nervous system of the great devourer made physical. The smallest and most numerous synapse creatures, things like Tyranid warriors, generate a local field of psychic influence that keeps the lesser organisms around them connected to the vast and alien will of the hive mind. Without this connection, the smaller Tyranids revert to something considerably less useful. The basic predatory instincts of very dangerous animals, snapping at whatever moves and generally losing the tight coordination that makes a Tyranid assault terrifying rather than simply overwhelmingly numerous. With the synapse connection intact, those same organisms move with the unified purpose of a single directed thought. flooding a choke point with the exact density and timing that the hive mind's processing has determined to be optimal for the given objective. The difference between the two states is the difference between a riot and a precision surgical strike conducted by a system with no concept of acceptable losses. Above the warriors in this synaptic hierarchy sit the hive tyrants. And this is where the creatures that most people recognize as the iconic and terrifying apex predators of the Tyranid swarm come into play. Because the hive tyrant is genuinely something special, even within the already extraordinary range of Tyranid bioforms. A hive tyrant, classified in imperial taxonomy as Tyrannicus prefactor, for whatever that is worth to anyone trying to make sense of them, stands roughly the height of a dreadnought, sometimes significantly taller. They are armored in layers of chitinous plate that has been growing and thickening across the span of their biological existence, each layer adding to the fortress they carry around what passes for their vital organs. They carry weapons that are not separate from their bodies but part of them, biocannons and venom throwers, and crushing claws that have been grown to specification by the Norn queens that birthed them, refined through whatever evolutionary pressures the hive mind's biological engineering has decided to apply in this particular instance. They are capable of absorbing punishment that would obliterate multiple space marines and simply continuing to advance, because the biological redundancy built into their bodies and the sheer mass of armor chitin they carry means that damage that would be instantly fatal to anything smaller simply does not stop them. They are terrifying physical specimens, but their physical capabilities, as impressive as they are not actually their most important attribute. That their greater value to the hive mind lies in their minds. A hive tyrant carries a direct, powerful, and exceptionally clear channel to the hive mind itself, a synaptic link so strong that it allows the vast intelligence of the Gestalt consciousness to be translated in real time into tactical direction that thousands of lesser creatures can act upon simultaneously. In the presence of a hive tyrant, the swarm stops being a collection of dangerous biological entities and becomes a coherent military force of staggering complexity and adaptability. Tyranid warriors adjust their fire patterns. Hormagaunts coordinate their assault vectors. Even the sessile venom-spitting organisms dig into positions with a precision that suggests someone with a very sophisticated understanding of overlapping fields of fire has been thinking about where they would be most effective. The hive tyrant is intelligent, frighteningly so. Smart in the particular and alien way that an entity evolved for war is smart, not creative in the human sense of that word, not capable of the lateral thinking that emerges from individual personality and experience and the strange associative leaps that human intelligence makes, but tactically brilliant in the most ruthlessly efficient way. They study battlefields. They adapt to unexpected developments with a speed that challenges even space marine response times. They identify priority targets with an accuracy that feels uncannily like genuine strategic understanding. And they are, individually, extraordinarily difficult to kill. And yet, for all the hive tyrant's capability, for all the terror it inspires, and the justified reputation it has earned across 1,000 battlefields, there exists something else, something that stands above the hive tyrant in exactly the way that the hive tyrant stands above the least of the swarm's foot soldiers. The law expresses this with a very specific and very deliberate phrase, and it is worth taking a moment to really absorb it. The Swarmlord, the codices tell us, is to a hive tyrant what a hive tyrant is to a termagant. Think about what that means. The hive tyrant's relationship to the termagant is one of near absolute superiority in every meaningful metric: strategic intelligence, physical capability, synaptic authority, resilience, the depth of its connection to the hive mind. Everything that makes the termagant what it is, the hive tyrant is more of, multiplied to a degree that makes direct comparison feel almost meaningless. And the Swarmlord bears that same relationship to the hive tyrant. Not marginally superior, not a somewhat more powerful variant of the same design. Categorically beyond it, in the same way that a grandmaster chess player is categorically beyond the understanding of someone who learned the rules last week. The Swarmlord is the thing the hive mind births when even a hive tyrant is not enough. When the prey world has proven stubborn enough, as intelligent enough, well-defended enough, that the standard biological toolkit of the Great Devourer has been deployed and found insufficient. The Swarmlord is the hive mind's last resort and its greatest asset, compressed into a single body and pointed at the problem that everything else has failed to solve. Now let us build the Swarmlord in your mind with some real precision, because the fear that radiates from every credible account of this creature is not just the general fear of something very large and very dangerous. It is a specific fear, the fear of something that is both physically overwhelming and obviously, unmistakably, thinking at you. The Swarmlord is constructed on the hive tyrant template, which means if you have a clear mental image of a hive tyrant, that massive or hunched silhouette of layered chitin and biological weaponry, the crest of bone that rises above its head like a crown no one would ever want to wear, the multiple limbs, and the weight of something that weighs more than a main battle tank and moves with unsettling fluidity. Then you have a starting point. But the Swarmlord differs from even the most powerful hive tyrant in ways that go considerably beyond simple scale, and those differences matter. The chitin that encases the Swarmlord is not freshly grown. It is old, genuinely, geologically old, in the biological sense that matters for Tyranid organisms. Tyranid creatures continue to grow across their lifespan, yet the chitin grows and hardens and adds layers that compress the previous layers and create armor that is genuinely unlike anything that was grown to a specification for a specific battlefield role. The Swarmlord has been living since the Tyranid race first came into existence, whatever that means in terms of biological age, and the hive mind's ability to recreate it means that each incarnation starts fresh in terms of body, even while it carries all the accumulated memories of every previous life. The biological template for the Swarmlord's body has been refined and tested and corrected across an incomprehensibly long period of time. The result is something that is not just heavily armored in the way that a hive tyrant is heavily armored, as it is armored in the way that something ancient always is, with layers so dense and so interlocked that they have ceased to be mere protection and become something closer to geological fact. Its posture carries a quality that multiple accounts consistently describe as regal, not regal in the way a human aristocrat is regal, not the performance of superiority, but the settled, comfortable reality of something that has never had occasion to doubt its position at the apex of whatever hierarchy it inhabits. The way certain very old predators move, with the assurance of creatures that have not needed to be afraid of anything in their environment for such a long time that the very capacity for fear has been functionally removed from their behavioral repertoire. The Swarmlord moves like that, across the battlefield, him through the bodies of whatever stands in its path, toward the thing it has identified as the primary obstacle to the hive mind's objective, with absolute, quiet certainty. The crest of bone that rises above its head is larger and more elaborate than any hive tyrant's. It gives the Swarmlord a silhouette that is recognizable even at great distance, which is somewhat academic, since any tactical situation in which you are trying to identify the Swarmlord at great distance is already a situation in which you are in significant danger. The eyes, and this is a detail that comes up in survivor accounts with enough consistency to merit serious attention, carry something. Not the flat animal blankness of a creature operating on instinct, not the cold machine precision of something executing a program. As something that people with the presence of mind to describe it in detail consistently reach for the word intelligence to characterize. An intelligence that is assessing, categorizing, running scenarios and projections, all while the body it inhabits is doing something else entirely, usually something very violent. And then there are the weapons, and this is where the Swarmlord distinguishes itself most immediately and in the most practically significant way from even the most powerful of its hive tyrant contemporaries. where a standard hive tyrant might carry any of the enormous variety of biological weapons in the Tyranid arsenal. The screaming organic cannon, the crushing appendages, the dripping venom sacs. The Swarmlord carries only 4 weapons, 4 bone swords, nothing else, no ranged apparatus. No crushing claws or armored talons as primary weapons, just 4 blades and the 4 arms to wield them. This sounds almost modest compared to the arsenal a hive tyrant might deploy. It is not modest. The bone sword, even in the hands of a standard hive tyrant, is already one of the most grotesquely effective melee weapons in the known galaxy. It is grown from living bone, refined to edges that operate at the monomolecular level, and it carries with it a psychic charge that disrupts the neural circuitry of anything it passes through. When a standard bone sword strikes a living creature, it does not simply cut. It interferes with the fundamental electrical signals of the nervous system at the point of contact, producing a cascading cellular disruption that goes well beyond the mechanical damage of the blade itself. The Space Marines have described being struck by lesser bone swords as feeling as though their nervous system was briefly reprogrammed. The Swarmlord's bone swords are not standard. Each of the 4 blades carries at its core a crystalline growth. This crystal is not bone. It is not chitin. It is not any material that has ever been catalogued from within the Milky Way galaxy. It is an extragalactic mineral, something absorbed into the Tyranid biological library during the eons the swarm spent consuming other galaxies, other star clusters, other concentrations of matter and life that existed before they became fuel for the great devourer's advance. Each crystal partially protrudes through the serrated surface of the blade it inhabits, and the crackling bioelectrical discharge that runs through the sword finds the crystal and is amplified, as is probably the most accessible word, changed in its nature by contact with a material that does not belong to this part of the universe, and which interacts with force fields and armor in ways that should not be physically possible. Practically speaking, these 4 blades can slice through adamantium, the hardest material the Imperium of man can reliably manufacture for large-scale production, as though it were a less challenging material. They can penetrate void shields. They can reach through the energy barriers generated by the most sophisticated power armor the Adeptus Astartes produces, and deliver the neural disruption and physical damage of the blade to whatever is underneath. There is almost nothing short of the most exotic war gear in the galaxy that reliably stops all 4 of them simultaneously. And the Swarmlord wields them with a skill that has been accumulating since before the concept of swordsmanship existed in this galaxy. The Swarmlord can move all 4 blades in defensive parries simultaneously, at speeds that multiple accounts describe as physically impossible for something of its size. This is not hyperbole in the accounts that mention it. It is the observer's genuine attempt to make sense of what they are seeing, which is a creature whose combat reflexes are operating at a level that defies intuitive physics. The result, practically speaking, is that attacking the Swarmlord in close combat with anything less than truly extraordinary skill or truly overwhelming force is something that tends to produce outcomes that are very good for the Swarmlord and very bad for whoever is doing the attacking. It parries. It redirects. It reads the sequence of an incoming attack at the moment of initiation and has already arranged its 4 blades into the optimal counter configuration by the time the blow lands, or doesn't land, as is far more commonly the case. The physical aspect of the Swarmlord is extraordinary, but it is not what makes the Swarmlord truly singular, what makes the Swarmlord the specific and irreplaceable asset that it is, the thing that justifies its existence from the hive mind's perspective and earns it the status of the supreme synapse creature, is what it does beyond its own body, what it does to every organism within its psychic range when it walks onto a battlefield. In the presence of the Swarmlord, the Tyranid swarm undergoes a transformation that veteran observers of Tyranid warfare describe as immediately and unmistakably noticeable. A hive tyrant-directed assault is already far more coordinated and purposeful than what a swarm looks like without synapse direction. But a Swarmlord-directed assault is something else again. The organisms stop being individually responsive to local conditions and start being pieces of a system. Not a mechanical system, something more organic than that, more fluid, more adaptive from moment to moment. But a system nonetheless, one in which every entity, from the largest biotitan to the smallest ripper swarm, instinctively knows its exact role, its exact timing, its exact priority target, without any detectable delay in receiving or processing that information. The swarm becomes, and in the presence of the Swarmlord, something that functions at very close to the theoretical optimum for a biological invasion force of its composition. Not because each organism is smarter, but because the intelligence directing all of them, simultaneously and in real time, is operating at a level that no other synapse creature can match. The shadow in the warp, that psychic phenomenon that precedes every hive fleet's advance and isolates its prey worlds by cutting off astropathic communication and making warp travel effectively impossible in the affected region, deepens significantly in the Swarmlord's immediate vicinity. The shadow in the warp is generated collectively by the entire swarm's psychic presence, but the Swarmlord is the most powerful single contributor to it that any hive fleet can field. In its presence, what was already making psyker abilities unreliable and communication near impossible becomes something closer to an absolute wall. The isolation of the prey world is not just strategic inconvenience, it is psychological devastation, the realization that no help is coming, that whatever cry for reinforcement might have been transmitted before the shadow fell has been swallowed by the static of the hive mind's psychic mass, and that whatever stands here now stands alone. Before we move on to the philosophy of how the Swarmlord exists and comes into being, it is worth spending some time in the middle ground between the hive tyrant and the Swarmlord, understanding more precisely what makes the Tyranid hierarchy function and why the Swarmlord occupies such a specific and irreplaceable position at its summit. Because this is not just a story about one very dangerous monster. It is a story about a biological system of command and control that has no real analogue anywhere else in the galaxy, and the Swarmlord is the apex of that system, the point where all the strange and alien logic of Tyranid intelligence reaches its fullest expression. The Tyranid hierarchy, in the sense that it can be understood by a military analyst, operates on a principle that the Imperium's own command structures would recognize as sound, even if they would be horrified by its specifics. Authority and intelligence flow downward. Smaller, less capable organisms serve the strategic purposes set by larger, more capable ones. The difference from any imperial structure, or indeed any humanoid structure of command, is that this hierarchy is not maintained through culture, tradition, rank, or conscious loyalty. It is maintained through psychic compulsion. The hive mind's will, expressed through the synapse network, overrides the individual biological impulses of every organism below it in the chain. There is no dissent. There is no ambition. There is no corruption of the hierarchy through the kinds of self-interested behavior that plague every mortal military structure. The smallest termagant and the greatest hive tyrant are both completely subject to the same overriding intelligence, and neither can act against that intelligence's expressed will, even if the concept of wanting to were available to them, which it is not. This makes the Tyranid swarm, in a purely tactical sense, extraordinarily difficult to disrupt through the methods that work against other militaries. You cannot buy off a Tyranid general. You cannot sow discord among the officer class. You cannot use propaganda to undermine the fighting will of the rank and file. You cannot assassinate the political leadership and cause a succession crisis. Every approach to warfare that relies on exploiting the internal tensions and limitations of an opponent composed of individuals with their own interests and their own survival instincts fails completely against a system where every organism is subordinated to a single intelligence that does not experience doubt, does not experience fear, and does not experience the kind of personal survival calculus that makes individual soldiers sometimes make choices that are bad for the overall mission. What you can do, what every successful engagement against the Tyranids has relied upon in some form, is eliminate the synapse creatures. Remove the relay points through which the hive mind's will is transmitted to the lesser organisms, and those organisms revert to their base instincts. A termagant without synapse direction is dangerous in the way that a very venomous and very aggressive animal is dangerous, but it is not coordinated, it is not purposeful, and it is not part of the coherent tactical system that makes the Tyranid assault so uniquely overwhelming. Killing synapse creatures creates holes in the hive mind's control network that cascade down through the organisms in the affected area, buying the defenders time and space to regroup. It is why Chaplain Ortan Cassius of the Ultramarines spent decades developing and spreading specialized anti-Tyranid doctrine among the chapter's tyrannic war veterans, and why that doctrine placed such specific emphasis on priority targeting of synapse creatures over simple engagement of the most immediately threatening organisms. The tactical logic is sound. Kill the synapse creatures, create chaos in the swarm, but it is a logic that works progressively less well as the synapse creatures become more powerful, more resilient, and better able to protect themselves from the approaches that have previously worked against them. A standard hive tyrant can be brought down by a well-coordinated assault with the right weapons, deployed at the right moment. It is dangerous work, but it is work that Space Marines have been doing for 300 years now and have developed doctrine for. The Swarmlord, however, is not a standard hive tyrant. And the doctrine that works against a standard hive tyrant does not straightforwardly transfer. The Swarmlord is aware of the tactical imperative to eliminate synapse creatures. It has been aware of it since the first time any species in any galaxy ever figured out that the Tyranid command structure had specific and exploitable nodes. It has been watching defenders attempt to implement this strategy against it for longer than human civilization has existed, and it has learned, across those eons of experience, exactly how to prevent it from being implemented against itself, how to position the swarm to protect its own position, how to ensure that whatever approaches toward it will have to fight through such overwhelming resistance that reaching it becomes a near impossibility, and how to identify and respond to the threat posed by particularly capable opponents before those opponents can close to effective range. The Swarmlord does not just direct the swarm. It thinks about its own protection as a strategic priority because it understands, with the clarity of something that has been killed before and knows exactly what that costs, that its continued presence on the battlefield is worth almost any tactical expenditure to preserve. This is why the kills that have been achieved against the Swarmlord have all required something exceptional. Not just skill, not just the right weapons, not even just courage, though all three have been present in every successful engagement. What they have required is the specific combination of a particular opponent at a particular moment, doing something specific that the Swarmlord's protective arrangements had not fully accounted for. Calgar on Ichar IV, fighting with the intuition born of decades of continuous Tyranid warfare that went beyond anything his analytical mind could consciously apply. Dante at Baal, with a broken bone sword lodged in his chest, creating an opportunity that could not have been planned for because it emerged from the exact physical configuration of that specific moment of the fight. Ortan Cassius on Colovan, a warrior who had been specifically training for exactly this engagement for 20 years since Macragge, and who understood the Swarmlord's fighting patterns at a level that most Space Marines never achieve. Each of these kills was exceptional. Each of them required something that could not easily be replicated. And understanding that is essential for understanding the challenge the Imperium faces in dealing with a threat that becomes marginally harder to kill in exactly the specific way it was previously killed each time it dies. Now, within the Tyranid hierarchy, above the standard hive tyrants, and beneath the Swarmlord itself, there are other organisms worth briefly understanding in the context of what they tell us about how the hive mind structures its intelligence. The Norn Queen, rarely seen and never engaged in direct combat, is the biological production facility of the swarm. the organism through which the hive mind's biological designs are translated into living flesh, the entity responsible for spawning everything from termagants to hive tyrants to the Swarmlord itself. Neurotyrants serve as powerful psychic monsters that radiate the shadow in the warp at a particularly potent level, while simultaneously acting as amplifiers for the synapse network. Norn emissaries, enormous and specifically tasked creatures, are deployed for singular strategic purposes: the assassination of a specific commander, the capture of a specific piece of intelligence, with the focused intensity of the hive mind's full attention brought to bear on a single objective. All of these are impressive. All of them are terrifying in their own right. None of them are the Swarmlord. None of them carry what the Swarmlord carries: the full, unfiltered strategic intelligence of the hive mind, combined with the autonomy to act on that intelligence in real time, the eons of accumulated experience that no other Tyranid organism possesses, and the specific status of being the one organism the hive mind will deploy only when everything else has been insufficient. The Swarmlord is not simply more powerful than these other organisms. It is different in nature. It occupies a category that no other Tyranid creature shares, and that uniqueness is what makes its presence on a battlefield the single most significant development that any defender can face. When the Swarmlord appears, the nature of the engagement has already changed, not just tactically, strategically, at the deepest level, because the Swarmlord's appearance signals that the hive mind has assessed this particular resistance as requiring its fullest and most sophisticated response. And that assessment, from an intelligence that has consumed galaxies, is not one that should be taken as anything other than what it is: the hive mind saying that you have done something impressive enough to require its most powerful tool. That might sound like faint praise. It is not. Many worlds never earn the Swarmlord's attention because they are consumed before conventional tactics ever fail. Earning the Swarmlord's presence means your world's defenders did something right. It is cold comfort, given the outcome that typically follows, but it is worth noting in the spirit of giving credit where it is owed. There is a philosophical strangeness to the way the Swarmlord comes into existence that is worth spending serious time with, because it reveals something important and genuinely surprising about the nature of the hive mind itself. And standard hive tyrants are recreated by the hive mind and the Norn queens through the normal processes of Tyranid biological production. When a hive tyrant is destroyed, the biological data it carried, the learned tactical adaptations and experiential knowledge of the organism is absorbed back into the hive mind to the extent that is possible, and eventually a new one is produced. This is the standard cycle of the Tyranid approach to the loss of significant organisms. Information is preserved and passed forward. Death is a setback in terms of the immediate tactical situation, but it is not the destruction of the knowledge that organism carried. That knowledge, in some form, continues. The Swarmlord follows this cycle, but with profound differences that speak directly to its unique status within the Tyranid hierarchy. The most important of these differences is that the Swarmlord does not simply carry forward some version of its predecessor's learned tactics. It carries forward the same experiences, the same character, the same complete and specific accumulated knowledge, as if the transfer were perfect rather than approximate. Each new Swarmlord body is, in the ways that matter most, the same being as every previous Swarmlord body, because every lesson, every previous iteration ever learned is stored in the hive mind, with a fidelity that goes beyond what the standard mechanism can achieve. The hive mind treats the Swarmlord's accumulated knowledge as a resource too valuable to allow the degradation that normal biological information transfer introduces, and so it maintains it with a care and precision. It does not extend to any other organism. This means the Swarmlord that walked onto Macragge carried within it the strategic knowledge of every engagement its previous incarnations had ever fought, across every galaxy the swarm had consumed, against every species that had ever mounted serious resistance. Every defeat it had suffered, catalogued and understood. Every victory, the tactics that produced it noted and stored, the full strategic library of a species that has been at war continuously for a timescale that makes human history look like a brief afternoon. And each time it is destroyed, each time some hero of the Imperium or the Tau Empire or whoever finds themselves in the path of the Great Devourer manages to actually bring the Swarmlord down, the data from that defeat is absorbed and incorporated into the template for the next version. This is the aspect of the Swarmlord's existence that, when you actually sit with it and follow it to its logical conclusion, produces the most genuine intellectual unease. The Swarmlord grows stronger from being killed. Not as a metaphor, not as a vague statement about resilience. Mechanically, specifically, the next version of the Swarmlord incorporates the tactical information of how it was defeated into its operational knowledge and adjusts accordingly. Every hero who has ever brought this creature down has contributed, unwillingly and unknowingly, to making the next version of it slightly harder to bring down in exactly the same way. The second strangeness of the Swarmlord's existence is when it is created. Hive tyrants are standard components of the Tyranid invasion apparatus, or the Norn queens that birthed the swarm produce them as a matter of course, as needed, filling the command structure of the assault with the biological commanders it requires. The Swarmlord does not work this way. Its reincarnation, the lore is careful to note, appears to be a stress-induced response. It is triggered not by a standard need for a battlefield commander, but by the specific condition of the hive mind encountering resistance it cannot break with its available tools. When conventional Tyranid strategies, the biological adaptation, the overwhelming weight of numbers, the endless evolutionary pressure that slowly works around every defense, have failed or are failing too slowly, the hive mind reaches into its deepest reserve. Think about what this means. The Swarmlord is the hive mind's admission, expressed in biological form, that there are problems its standard tools cannot solve. Problems that require something the hive mind itself, for all its vast intelligence, cannot directly provide. The specific kind of tactical creativity and individual strategic judgment that emerges from a mind with genuine autonomy, working in real time, without the overhead of coordinating billions of organisms. The hive mind is too large and too distributed to be nimble in the way that close-quarters tactical decision-making requires. It can direct the swarm toward a general objective. It can adapt over the course of days and weeks and months. But it cannot, not quickly enough. Why do the thing that the best mortal generals do, read the battlefield as it changes from moment to moment, and make decisions that account for the specific personality and capability of the opponent directly in front of them.
Okay, real talk for a second, and I say this as someone who has read a lot of 40k lore across a lot of factions. The Swarmlord genuinely unsettles me in a way that most villains in this setting just don't. Like, Chaos Lords are terrifying, sure. Demon Primarchs are horrifying, but there's something about the Swarmlord specifically that gets under my skin more than almost anything else. Because with Chaos, you can at least conceptually argue with it. There's something there, desire, pride, corruption, a twisted version of something you can almost recognize. But the Swarmlord, there's nothing to argue with, nothing to appeal to. It doesn't hate you. It doesn't even really notice you as an individual. It just looks at you at whatever you've built, your home, your chapter, your civilization, and sees biomass. That's it, that flat, cold assessment delivered by something 1,000,000 years old with 4 galaxy-spanning crystal blades is the thing that sticks with me every time I read about it. It's the most alien thing in a setting full of alien things, and somehow that makes it the most scariest one of all. But anyways, that's just my take on it. Let's go back to the video.
The Swarmlord can do this. It is given, uniquely among all Tyranid organisms, a degree of genuine mental autonomy from the hive mind. Not independence. The hive mind's psychic connection to the Swarmlord remains overwhelming, and the creature's fundamental purpose and drives are as aligned with the hive mind's agenda as any other Tyranid organism. But within that framework, the Swarmlord is allowed to think, to make judgment calls, as to identify the specific weakness in a specific general's specific approach to a specific battle and exploit it with a timing and precision that the broader hive mind could not achieve without the Swarmlord as an intermediate. It is the closest thing to a truly individual intelligence that the Great Devourer has ever produced. And it exists specifically because even the hive mind recognized that it needed something that could think for itself. This creates a somewhat paradoxical picture of the hive mind as an entity. On one level, it is presented in the lore as an almost omnipotent intelligence, a vast and ancient consciousness of incomprehensible scope. On another level, it has recognized its own limitations clearly enough to evolve a specific organism whose entire purpose is to compensate for those limitations in tactical situations. Yet the Swarmlord is, simultaneously, the hive mind's greatest weapon, and its implicit acknowledgement that there are things it cannot do alone. There is something almost poignant about that, in the way that the grand strategies of very powerful entities occasionally reveal their blind spots not in what they admit, but in what they feel compelled to create. There is only ever one Swarmlord in existence at any given moment, though the lore does float the possibility that multiple bodies under the same controlling consciousness might exist simultaneously in very specific circumstances. As a general rule, the Swarmlord is singular. There is one, and wherever it directs its attention, whatever hive fleet it chooses to emerge among, because the Swarmlord's connection to the hive mind is so strong that it can transcend the physical separation between different fleets and appear among any of them, an ability no other Tyranid organism possesses. That fleet becomes something qualitatively different from what it was without the Swarmlord's guidance. It fights differently. It thinks. It pursues objectives with a strategic coherence that, for any veteran of Tyranid warfare who knows what to look for, is an unmistakable signature. The presence of the Swarmlord on a given front is detectable not from visual identification, but from the sudden and dramatic improvement in the quality of the decisions being made by the entire opposing force. Before we reach the battles that the Imperium of Man has records of, we should spend some time with what is known, and it is frustratingly, appropriately little, about what the Swarmlord did before it ever turned its attention toward the Milky Way. The Tyranids are not native to this galaxy. This is fundamental and established law, and it sits at the foundation of everything that makes the Tyranid threat so philosophically different from every other existential threat the Imperium faces. The forces of chaos threaten from within and from the immaterium, but they are in some sense native to the reality the Imperium inhabits. The various Xenos civilizations, however hostile, are part of the same galactic history as humanity. The Tyranids came from somewhere else, from the cold void between galaxies, or from a darkness so complete and so isolated that even the light of stars took hundreds of thousands of years to cross it. They came from outside, and they came hungry, and they had been traveling for an incomprehensibly long time before they arrived. Some calculations, based on what can be inferred from the apparent direction of their approach and the speed at which they have been observed to travel, suggest that the Tyranid fleet may have been in transit for something in the range of millions of years before reaching the Milky Way's edge. During that transit, they consumed what they found. The void between galaxies is not empty. There are star clusters, dwarf galaxies, stray concentrations of matter that drifted away from larger structures across the eons of universal history. And the Tyranids are following whatever ancient instinct or intelligence directs their course through intergalactic space, consumed those too. The Swarmlord was present for all of it. As old as the Tyranid race itself, the lore asserts, without elaboration or qualification. Not a later development, not an improvement made after the first few galaxies had been consumed. Present from the beginning, from whatever point in the Tyranid species' history, the hive mind first recognized that some prey requires something beyond numbers and biological adaptation to overcome. The Swarmlord has been the hive mind's solution to that problem since the solution was first needed. This means the accumulated tactical experience the Swarmlord carries is not measured in decades or centuries or even millennia. It is measured in the lifetimes of civilizations, yet in the falls of entire species, in the silent deaths of cultures sophisticated enough to have names and histories and presumably enough military capability to make destroying them genuinely challenging before those names and histories were absorbed into the biological substrate of the Great Devourer. Every galaxy the swarm has consumed, every civilization within those galaxies that mounted a serious enough defense to require the Swarmlord's particular capabilities. All of it is in there, preserved in the hive mind's biological memory, and available to each new incarnation of the Swarmlord as reference material. We know this indirectly from the titles it carries. The hive mind does not trade in names in the human sense. Names are individual things, and the hive mind does not, fundamentally, think in terms of individuals. But the species the Swarmlord has destroyed apparently had names for it before they ceased to exist, and those names, absorbed along with everything else that those species knew, have survived in the fragmentary, xenoarchaeological record that the Inquisition maintains on the Great Devourer. Tyrant Lord of the hive mind. Straightforward, a recognition of its supreme position within the Tyranid command structure, applied by whatever civilization first managed to understand that the Tyranid hierarchy existed and that this creature sat at its apex. Herald of the Great Devourer, more evocative, suggesting a civilization that understood the role the Swarmlord played in the arrival of something larger than itself, the advance agent of an apocalypse, the thing that came before and made the main horror possible. These are descriptive titles, as they tell us how species understood the Swarmlord in functional terms. But the third title is the one that sits most heavily, the Destroyer of the Kala Empire. And this title matters not for what it tells us about the Swarmlord, but for what it tells us about the Kala Empire. This was a civilization sophisticated enough to have built what deserved to be called an empire, organized enough to have a name, presumably defended well enough to have required the Swarmlord's specific capabilities to overcome. Otherwise, it would have been consumed without the Swarmlord ever needing to be present. And yet, it is gone. Completely and irrevocably gone. Not in the way that defeated civilizations often persist in some diminished form, but in the way that consumed things go. Not destroyed, but absorbed. Its biomass now part of the swarm. Its cultural and biological knowledge preserved in the hive mind's library, its name surviving only as a title in the designation of the thing that ended it. What did the Kala Empire look like? We will never know. What technology did they have? What strategies did they deploy? How long did they resist? What was the last thought of the last surviving member of their species? None of these questions have answers that are accessible to any living being. The Kala Empire is gone, and the Swarmlord carries their name, a trophy and a memorial simultaneously, a reminder that it has done this before, and that the Kala were not the first, and the Milky Way galaxy will not be the last. The Swarmlord also carries implicit histories in what we can infer from the Tyranid's biological adaptations. They have consumed species that fought with psychic warfare at scales that the Imperium can barely imagine. They have consumed races whose technological capabilities exceeded anything currently in production in the galaxy. They have consumed civilizations that relied on individual champions in the highest martial tradition, and civilizations that relied on coordinated mass military action, and civilizations that built their defenses around fortifications rather than field armies. All of these approaches, all of these strategies, all of the variations on the theme of survival that intelligence has ever produced against the Great Devourer, the Swarmlord knows them. Not as historical curiosities, but as tactical references. Not as things that happened long ago and far away, but as lived experience, are preserved in the hive mind's biological memory and instantly available through the synaptic connection. This is why the Swarmlord's intelligence is qualitatively different from even the most brilliant individual strategist in the galaxy. A great general might have decades of experience. A truly exceptional one might have a century. The Swarmlord has something that makes a century seem like a brief afternoon experiment. And crucially, it has not been accumulating experience against the same general type of opponent with the same general type of weapons and the same general type of tactical traditions. It has been accumulating experience across the full range of what intelligence can produce in its attempts to fight off the Great Devourer, which is to say, the full range of what intelligent life has ever thought of as a way to survive. Or the number of genuinely novel approaches remaining, tactics that the Swarmlord has never encountered and never had reason to develop a counter for, grows smaller with every passing engagement. The Milky Way had no warning, not a real warning, not in time. The first genuine indication that something was fundamentally wrong came not from military intelligence or inquisitorial surveillance, but from the simple and deeply disturbing observation that planets along the eastern fringe of the galaxy had begun going silent. Not devastated, not war-damaged, just gone, stripped to bare rock in a way that challenged conventional understanding of how large-scale conflict works. Because even the most total war leaves ruins and corpses and the chemical signatures of life having existed there. These worlds had nothing, down to the bacterial level, on down to the last trace of organic chemistry in what had previously been their soils and seas and atmospheres. Something had been here, had taken everything, and had moved on without leaving a single molecule that could tell a subsequent observer what had happened. The reports accumulated slowly across the vast and creaking bureaucracy of the Imperium of Man. Inquisitor Fidus Cryptman of the Ordo Xenos was one of the very few who read the fragmentary accounts and understood that they were not separate phenomena, not unrelated anomalies to be filed and forgotten. He saw the pattern. A wave of total biological stripping moving from the eastern fringe inward, system by system, at a pace and in a direction that spoke of coordinated advance rather than natural disaster. He dispatched himself to investigate, and traveling ahead of the advancing darkness, trying to reach the front of something he was not yet able to name. When he reached the Adeptus Mechanicus outpost on Tyran Primus, he found a world that had already been processed, stripped to bare rock, every trace of organic material removed, as silent as if nothing had ever lived there. Almost nothing remained. But in a bore shaft, 3,000 meters below the command bunker of the outpost, a far-sighted Magos named Varnak had hidden a data codex in the last hours before the end. This codex, which Cryptman recovered at the risk of his life and his sanity, was the first real intelligence document the Imperium would ever have on the creatures that had destroyed an entire world's worth of life in a matter of hours. The name Tyranid was assigned to these invaders at that moment, and derived from the name of the world where they were first properly observed and documented. And from that point forward, the race that would define the greatest threat to the continued existence of the Milky Way galaxy entered Imperial awareness through the trembling hands of an Inquisitor standing alone in the ruins of a dead world, holding a data slate in the silence where millions of organisms had recently lived. Cryptman moved fast. Using the last functional telepathica matrix at a system called Thandros to broadcast his warning, he managed to get the information moving through the astropathic relay network just ahead of the advancing fleet. By the time the message reached Macragge, the homeworld of the Ultramarines, chapter of Space Marines, the administrative heart of Ultramar and the most heavily fortified region of the Eastern Fringe, the fleet had consumed Thandros as well. Its leading elements were hours away. What would be named Hive Fleet Behemoth, the first major Tyranid incursion into the Milky Way, was already committed to its course, and its course led directly to the heart of Ultramar. Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, had built his reputation across centuries of warfare as one of the most capable military commanders the Astartes had produced since the Primarchs. His tactical intelligence was not the simple physical superiority of a space marine bearing down on an opponent with overwhelming firepower. It was genuine strategic sophistication, The product of hundreds of years of command experience combined with the analytical capabilities the Ultramarines are specifically bred and trained to develop. He had never faced anything like the Tyranids. Nobody in the Imperium had. But he read Cryptman's intelligence with the seriousness it deserved and made a decision that would define the history of the Ultramarines for the next century and a half. Macragge would hold. There would be no strategic withdrawal, no attempt to fall back to more defensible ground elsewhere in Ultramar. The line would be drawn here, on the chapter's homeworld, and either the Tyranids would be stopped, or the Ultramarines would be destroyed in the attempt. Calgar began fortifying immediately, repositioning, adapting his defensive strategy as new information came in about the nature of the approaching enemy, or developing counter-tactics against an opponent unlike any he had studied. He was learning on the move, against an enemy that was also learning, and both sides of that equation mattered enormously for what came next. What Calgar did not know, because there was no surviving intelligence on it, was that somewhere in the spawning chambers of Hive Fleet Behemoth's largest bioships, something was being prepared. The Hive mind had encountered Calgar's initial resistance, the early engagements as the fleet consumed its way through Ultramar's outer systems, and had made an assessment. This particular defender, and the particularly capable chapter behind him, was not going to be broken by standard biological pressure and overwhelming numbers alone. Not quickly enough, or not without a response that the standard toolkit of the Hive Tyrant hierarchy could not provide. The Hive mind reached into its deepest reserve. The Swarmlord would go to Macragge. The battle for Macragge was not a single engagement, but a series of them. Ground actions unfolding simultaneously with a desperate space battle in orbit as the Ultramarines fleet tried to hold back a tide that massively outnumbered it. On the ground, Calgar fought brilliantly. His tactical decisions consistently gave his forces advantages they should not have had against the weight of the swarm. Carefully chosen kill zones that maximized the firepower of every defender, hit-and-run engagements that blunted the swarm's assault without committing to the kind of static defense that pure numbers would eventually overwhelm. As constant repositioning that denied the Tyranids the easy victories of a slow and predictable enemy. But the Hive mind was learning. Everything Calgar did was catalogued in real time, fed into the processing capacity of the swarm's collective intelligence, analyzed and countered. The Tyranid assault was adapting to him as he adapted to it. A dynamic that no human opponent could sustain for long against a mind that does not sleep and does not need to rest, and processes battlefield data at speeds that biological brains cannot match. The pressure on Calgar's positions was incrementally, relentlessly, intelligently increasing. Then came Cold Steel Ridge, an industrial complex built on the frozen northern seas of Macragge, while a place where the temperature was savage enough that human workers had required heating systems in their suits, and even space marines felt the bite of it through their power armor. Calgar had been pushed back from his earlier positions by the accumulating pressure of the swarm, had lost the bulk of his auxiliary forces to a spectacularly successful Genestealer infiltration of the Sirocco starport, and had made the decision to make his stand here at Cold Steel Ridge with the forces he had remaining. The goal was to buy time, enough time for the polar fortresses at the north and south of the planet to be reinforced to the point where they could sustain a prolonged siege. It was here, at Cold Steel Ridge, that the Swarmlord appeared on Macragge's surface for the first time. The accounts that survive this engagement are fragmentary, as accounts from engagements of this kind tend to be. Most of the people present did not survive to write coherent reports afterward, but what is consistent across all surviving testimony is the quality of the change that came over the Tyranid assault when the Swarmlord arrived. It was not simply that a larger and more dangerous creature had entered the field. It was that the entire opposing force, the thousands of organisms already engaged with Calgar's positions, shifted in their behavior. The randomness, the slightly predatory chaos of even a well-directed Tyranid assault drained away. What replaced it was something that felt purposeful in a way that went beyond biological programming. The swarm began to move with the precision of a plan that had been thought through by someone who understood Khalga's defenses at Cold Steel Ridge better than the defenders themselves. The Swarmlord walked out ahead of the main swarm and issued a challenge to Khalga in the only language a Tyranid creature can issue challenges: the physical fact of its presence. Advancing directly toward the chapter master's position, 4 bone zords crackling in the frozen air, and Khalga responded with the same directness, because that is what a chapter master of the Ultramarines does when the enemy's greatest champion walks across the field toward him. He went forward to meet it. What followed was one of the most brutal close combat engagements the First Tyrannic War produced. The Swarmlord had studied every move Khalga had made in the preceding engagements. It read his fighting style from his first moves and began to counter it with a precision that his honor guard, fighting at his side, could not compensate for. The blade work of the Swarmlord was not the aggressive expression of a powerful predator throwing its strength against a prey item. It was surgical, probing, finding the edges of Khalga's guard and exploiting them with a patience that felt almost contemptuous. Not the contempt of something that hates what it faces, but the detachment of something that has already worked out the solution to the equation in front of it, and is simply executing the conclusion. Commander of the Honor Guard, Aloysius died, throwing himself bodily between Khalga and the Swarmlord's blades. Buying seconds that he knew would cost him everything, because those seconds were what the Thunderhawk gunships screaming down from orbit needed to clear a landing zone and extract Khalga from the field. The gunships came. They blasted the Tyranid tide back just enough, and Aloysius fell to the Swarmlord's blades as the engines lifted off and carried Khalga, badly broken, missing his arms and his legs, damaged in ways that would have killed any being without the extraordinary biology of a space marine, back to orbit. The cost of that extraction is almost impossible to overstate. Khalga lost his limbs. He lost an eye. He sustained internal damage of a severity that kept him in a medical bay aboard the battle barge Octavius for the remainder of the ground battle. Cold Steel Ridge fell, as the Swarmlord had intended it to fall, and the path to the northern polar fortress was open. The northern polar fortress was defended by the Ultramarines' First Company, 100 Terminators in tactical dreadnought armor, the most elite warriors in one of the galaxy's most elite chapters, commanded by First Captain Saul Invictus, a warrior whose centuries of service had produced a combat record that read like a history of the Ultramarines' greatest challenges. They fought with the absolute commitment that the situation demanded, because they understood what failure meant and they had no intention of failing. They sold their positions inch by inch, each Terminator making the Swarmlord's advance cost as much as possible, holding until there was nowhere left to hold. None of them survived. The entire Ultramarines' First Company was destroyed to the last warrior. When the company banner fell, when the last Terminator fell, Invictus died, most likely in direct combat with the Swarmlord, because that is where he would have been when the end came. The Swarmlord stood in the ruins of the northern polar fortress as the last guns fell silent. But Macragge survived. The sacrifice of the Dominus Astra in the space battle above Circe, the Emperor-class battleship driven into the heart of Hive Fleet Behemoth and its warp drives detonated, creating a catastrophic vortex that destroyed the majority of the Tyranid fleet, broke the coherence of the invasion. Without the fleet, the ground forces on Macragge were isolated and could be steadily eliminated by Ultramarine forces returning from orbit. The Tyranids were scoured from the surface over the following months, at the cost of further terrible casualties, as official Imperial reports listed the Swarmlord as destroyed. But no body was ever found. The damage to whatever organism had been identified as the Swarmlord made certain identification impossible, the reports noted, carefully and without great emphasis. The rumors that persisted afterward, that the creature had somehow escaped, that its consciousness had returned to the hive mind, that the Ultramarines had won the battle, but not truly ended what they had faced, would prove, in the decades that followed, to have been entirely accurate. It took the Ultramarines 116 years to officially record that they had replaced the losses from the Battle of Macragge. 116 years. The Swarmlord had visited a wound on the chapter that did not fully close for over a century. And then the chapter had to stand there and know that the creature responsible was still out there, still accumulating data, still learning from the engagement, still growing toward whatever the next iteration would bring. The Swarmlord appeared in Imperial records several more times in the years between Macragge and the Second Tyrannic War, each appearance adding to the growing picture of a threat that refused to be contained by any one campaign, any one defeat, any one chapter master's success. Between 889 and 903 of the 41st Millennium, it appeared on Viorlos, within the territory of the Farsight enclaves, the breakaway Tau faction that Commander Farsight had established after defying the orders of the Ethereal Council and refusing to return to the Tau Empire. But the Swarmlord was directing Tyranid forces in an assault on Tau-held positions there, and the engagement produced an observation that sits in inquisitorial records as one of the more quietly alarming tactical demonstrations from any Tyranid commander. From the planet's surface, with no orbital observation capability of its own and no communication link to any platform that could provide targeting data, the Swarmlord identified the orbital trajectories of Tau warships above Viorlos and began directing ground-based Tyranid bioartillery to target them, not randomly, not through some approximation, with accuracy sufficient to actually achieve hits on vessels in orbit, from the ground, without instrumentation, without communication infrastructure, without anything except the direct processing capability of a mind that had apparently developed, across its eons of accumulated experience, the ability to model orbital mechanics and ballistic trajectories through some combination of direct observation, atmospheric sensing, and the kind of three-dimensional spatial reasoning that human military science would require sophisticated computer systems to replicate at all. The Tau's greatest military advantages, their superior ranged weapons technology, their highly mobile battlesuits, the flexibility that their fire support doctrine provides, are all, in some sense, oriented around a model of warfare in which range provides safety and standoff capability provides options. The Swarmlord looked at a Tau defensive deployment on Viorlos, but identified the vulnerability in the assumption that what was in orbit was beyond ground-based reach, and eliminated that assumption. Not with counter-technology, not with reverse-engineered orbital platforms, with biology, coordination, and a mind that simply saw the angles differently than the Tau had anticipated any ground-based adversary would see them. Viorlos was consumed. The Tau defenders were driven back with losses that, while not the total annihilation of a catastrophic defeat, significantly degraded their capability in the region and demonstrated to subsequent analysts something important about the Swarmlord's approach to adversaries. It does not fight you the way you expected to be fought. It fights you the way that the full picture of your defensive posture, analyzed without the assumptions that shaped your planning, it suggests you can most efficiently be defeated. Then came Ichar IV, in 991 of the 41st Millennium, Hive Fleet Kraken, the second major hive fleet, different from Behemoth in its approach, hitting multiple systems simultaneously rather than in a single overwhelming thrust, had spread across dozens of worlds, and the Swarmlord was directing one of the critical engagements. Marneus Calga came to Ichar IV personally, rebuilt, augmented with cybernetic replacements for the limbs and the eye that Macragge had cost him, carrying decades of additional combat experience and the specific study of Tyranid warfare that had consumed much of his intellectual attention since that first catastrophic encounter. He was not the same commander he had been on Cold Steel Ridge. He had spent years thinking about how he had failed there, was where the Swarmlord had outmaneuvered him, what he would do differently if they met again. They met again on Ichar IV. The sources do not give us the full specifics of the duel itself. Accounts from engagements at that intensity are always partial, always filtered through the perspective of whoever survived near enough to see something coherent. But the outcome is confirmed. the Swarmlord was defeated in single combat with Calgar. The man who had barely survived their first meeting, who had lost his limbs to the creature's blades at Cold Steel Ridge, stood across from it on Ichar IV and won. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy to read the Swarmlord's victory at Macragge and the long catalogue of civilizations it has destroyed and conclude that it is effectively invincible against any mortal opponent. It is not. Calgar proved that. And understanding why he was able to defeat it on Ichar IV when he nearly died at Cold Steel Ridge tells us something important about the nature of the Swarmlord's intelligence and its limits. The Swarmlord's tactical intelligence is extraordinary. Its accumulated strategic knowledge is unparalleled among any individual commander in the galaxy. But there is a specific kind of combat intelligence that even millions of years of accumulated experience cannot fully account for. The specific, embodied, instinctive brilliance of a particular individual fighting for their life in real time. Calgar had not just studied Tyranid warfare in the years between Macragge and Ichar IV. He had lived it. He had spent decades leading engagements against Tyranid forces, as developing a combat intuition for the specific rhythms of how the swarm fights. He knew, in his body, not just in his mind, things about how to fight Tyranids that no amount of strategic analysis could produce. And when he fought the Swarmlord on Ichar IV, he brought that embodied knowledge to bear in ways that the Swarmlord's accumulated strategic database, however vast, could not entirely predict. This is perhaps the deepest tension in the Swarmlord's existence. Its intelligence is real, genuine, extraordinarily capable, but intelligence is not omniscience. And the Swarmlord fights individuals, and individuals, especially the kind of individuals who become chapter masters of Space Marine chapters, are, in their finest moments, capable of things that no prior model could fully anticipate. Calgar won on Ichar IV. The Swarmlord died. Maya was absorbed into the hive mind, and the template was updated with everything that engagement had taught it. The next iteration would know how Calgar had killed it. But that was a problem for the future. The aftermath of Ichar IV deserves some attention, because it represents something rare in the history of the Tyrannic Wars. A moment when the Imperium could, briefly, assess what had happened and try to understand what it meant. Hive Fleet Kraken, unlike Behemoth before it, had not been concentrated into a single mass that could be shattered in a decisive engagement. Kraken had spread its tendrils across dozens of systems simultaneously, and breaking those tendrils required the same exhausting, world-by-world commitment that had defined the fight against Behemoth, but multiplied across a much larger front. The Swarmlord's defeat on Ichar IV was a significant moment, but it did not end Kraken. The swarm continued to press from every direction, consuming systems and retreating when pressed too hard, always looking for the gap in the Imperium's overextended defenses. What Ichar IV did do was teach the Imperium something. Chaplain Orton Cassius, who had been among the Ultramarines present on Macragge during the First Tyrannic War and who had been consumed by the study of Tyranid tactics in the years since, had been developing a specialized doctrine specifically aimed at training warriors to fight the Great Devourer. The Tyrannic War veterans, a unit he had created in the aftermath of Macragge, were the practical expression of that doctrine. Space Marines who had studied the Tyranids with the same depth that the Swarmlord studied its enemies. After Ichar IV, and after the defeat of Hive Fleet Kraken through the enormous effort of the Second Tyrannic War, Cassius found himself with something unprecedented. Detailed tactical records from 2 major Hive Fleet engagements, including 2 confirmed encounters with the Swarmlord itself. The conclusions he drew from those records were not encouraging, but they were useful. The Swarmlord, he observed, was not simply more powerful than any other Tyranid commander. It was specifically different in its tactical behavior in ways that could, if you studied them carefully enough and had the right kind of mind, be partially predicted. It showed preferences, not the rigid preferences of an unimaginative tactician, but the tendencies of an intelligence that had specific frameworks for approaching specific types of opponent. At the Swarmlord, fighting a Space Marine chapter responded differently than reports suggested it responded when fighting the Tau. or when fighting orc forces, because the underlying military traditions and the specific capabilities of each opponent called for different approaches. These tendencies could not reliably be exploited in the moment of combat. The Swarmlord adapted too quickly for any static plan based on observed tendencies to work more than once. But understanding them gave defenders something: the ability to recognize, very early in an engagement, what approach the Swarmlord was deploying, and therefore what it would likely do next. Cassius codified this knowledge and added it to the body of doctrine that the tyrannic war veterans trained against. But he also added another piece of intelligence that was more operationally significant. The Swarmlord's absence was as informative as its presence. When the Swarmlord was not on a given battlefield, the Tyranid assault there had a specific quality, coordinated by hive tyrants, capable and dangerous, but lacking the qualitative step change in tactical sophistication that the Swarmlord's presence produced. A defender who knew what to look for could tell the difference, and a defender who could tell the difference could adjust their resource allocation accordingly, holding the line where the Swarmlord was not, while concentrating everything available to the front, where the assault had that unmistakable quality of something thinking several moves ahead. It was not a solution. It was a better understanding of the problem. And in the business of fighting the Great Devourer, where solutions in the full sense of the word are rarely available, a better understanding of the problem is genuinely valuable. The Swarmlord reappeared after Ichar IV on multiple fronts, its presence indicated by the tactical signatures Cassius had identified, the sudden improvement in Tyranid coordination that followed its arrival, the way even the movement of lesser organisms shifted from purposeful aggression to something that felt more like chess pieces moving towards specific positions on a board. It directed engagements in the aftermath of Kraken's defeat, picking up the pieces of the broken fleet and turning them toward new objectives with the efficiency of an intelligence that had no investment in the distinction between victory and defeat in any individual engagement, only in the overall progress of the hive mind's advance. The years of the late 41st millennium brought new hive fleets and new catastrophes. Hive Fleet Gorgon, with its extraordinary adaptive toxins, shattered against the Iron Hands and their allies at Nimbosa and other worlds, but consumed enormous amounts before it was broken. The Octarius War, where the Swarmlord directed Leviathan forces against the Orc Empire there, ground on with terrible losses on both sides, and produced Tyranid strains optimized against Orc physiology that would be horrifyingly effective elsewhere. And then, in the final years of the 41st millennium, Hive Fleet Leviathan, already identified as the largest hive fleet yet encountered, turned a significant portion of its force toward a single target: Baal, the homeworld of the Blood Angels. But Commander Dante had been chapter master of the Blood Angels for over 1,000 years. This is a fact so extraordinary that it bears a moment of genuine consideration. Most Space Marines live for centuries. A chapter master who has served in that position for 1,000 years is not just experienced in the normal sense of that word. He is a living repository of strategic knowledge that spans an era, a man who has watched entire generations of enemies rise and fall and adapted his understanding of war accordingly. He had fought across so many campaigns against so many opponents that the specific catalogue of his battles would fill volumes. Yet he wore the golden death mask of Sanguinius and carried the weight of a prophecy that had haunted him for centuries. Visions of a golden warrior dying at the gates of the Blood Angels' fortress monastery, a death that his longest-serving warrior priests had spent generations interpreting and debating. When the intelligence came that Hive Fleet Leviathan was moving on Baal, Dante understood immediately what kind of engagement this was going to be. Not a raid, not a splinter fleet probing for weakness, a full commitment, the hive mind having identified the Blood Angels' homeworld as a target worthy of devoting a massive proportion of Leviathan's available force to. He called for help from every successor chapter that shared the Blood Angels' gene seed, and they came. The Flesh Tearers under Gabriel Seth, the Blood Drinkers, the Carmine Blades, the Knights of Blood despite their excommunicate status, dozens of others. By the time the fleet arrived, nearly 30,000 Space Marines were assembled in defense of Baal and its twin moons. the largest gathering of the sons of Sanguinius since the Horus heresy. The Leviathan fleet that arrived at Baal was described by survivors as so vast that it blotted the stars from view when seen from the planetary surface. In excess of 50,000 bioships, a number that makes the imagination work hard to process it. Dante's naval forces threw themselves into the teeth of this armada with everything they had: 21 battle barges and 94 strike cruisers, leading the engagement alongside hundreds of smaller vessels, nuclear warheads deployed at scale, everything that the most desperate offensive action available could produce. Over 300 hive ships were destroyed. The Tyranid advance did not slow. On the ground, the defenders fought with the particular quality of courage that the sons of Sanguinius are capable of when the situation is its most dire, a courage that in Blood Angels borders on the transcendent, informed by the knowledge that each of them carries 2 curses in their gene seed that might consume them before any enemy gets the chance, and that they are fighting anyway. Horus Heresy-era fortifications were recommissioned. A moat of something called thirst water, toxic to Tyranid biology, hundreds of meters wide, was created to bleed the early waves. All Death Company warriors from every chapter present were unleashed in a single mass. The controlled madness of their black rage turned into a weapon, a wall of genetically cursed warriors driving into the tide with the absolute commitment of beings who have already made peace with dying. 5 chapter masters fell in combat before the defensive lines fully collapsed. 3 of them at the Dome of Angels alone in a single engagement. And then the Swarmlord arrived on the surface of Baal, and the character of the assault changed. The Swarmlord's presence at Baal is described in surviving accounts, and in the novel that most fully covers the engagement, Guy Haley's Devastation of Baal, as a qualitative shift that was unmistakable to every experienced commander present. A lictor found its way into the Arx Angelicum, the Blood Angels' fortress monastery, and destroyed the main reactor, as taking the Void Shield array offline at precisely the moment the assault on the monastery's outer walls was reaching its peak. This was not coincidence. The Swarmlord had been building toward that moment, timing its assault to reach the critical pressure point at exactly the moment the fortress's primary defense failed. Genestealers infiltrated the Hall of Sarcophagi and killed the vast majority of the chapter's sleeping neophytes. Young warriors who had only just received the gene seed and had not yet completed their transformation into full Space Marines. This was not just a tactical blow in the immediate sense. It was a generational blow, a wound to the Blood Angels' ability to recruit and train the next generation of warriors that would not be fully felt for decades. The Swarmlord was not just fighting the battle in front of it. It was killing the chapter's future. Dante watched. He watched the fortress fall around him. He watched 5 chapter masters die. He watched the Swarmlord direct its assault, with the terrible patience of something that had studied the Blood Angels through the hive mind's accumulated knowledge of every previous engagement against them, catalogued their tactics, identified their psychological vulnerabilities, and was now executing a plan designed specifically for them. He made a decision. All remaining Space Marines, every survivor from every chapter present, were inducted into the Death Company, using ash and blood and grime in place of paint, because the sacred black paint of the Death Company had run out. They stood there as a body of warriors who had accepted that they were already dead, because accepting death and choosing how to spend what remained was the only freedom left to them. Dante gave a speech. The accounts do not preserve its exact words, but the shape of it is consistent. He told his brothers what he told himself, that they were not soldiers following orders. They were chosen for this moment, that their deaths would mean something, that the Blood Angel's name would be spoken with awe by whatever came after. He opened the Tower of Amareo and released its inmates, warriors so deeply consumed by the red thirst and the black rage that they were barely coherent. The most extreme cases of the chapter's twin curses, beings who could no longer be trusted in a controlled tactical situation, but who, pointed at the enemy and released, were some of the most terrifying close combat weapons in the Imperium's arsenal. They came out howling, and they died gloriously, and they bought seconds. Dante fought toward the Swarmlord because killing it was the only thing left to do that could change the outcome. It was directing the assault. It was the hive mind's presence on this battlefield. Ending it would not end the Tyranid advance, but it might break the coordination long enough, create enough chaos in the swarm's command structure to give the battered survivors a chance to survive until something changed. He fought through the tide of organisms with the Axe Mortalis, the ancient and sacred weapon of his office, fighting with a skill that represented 1,000 years of continuous development and a rage that he was barely keeping short of the Black Rage itself. In the monster's eyes, he saw an ancient and powerful intellect, and he pitied it, whilst in the moment between recognizing what it was and attacking it. The hunger in those eyes, the vastness of the need that the Swarmlord embodied, made the red thirst that the Blood Angels struggled against their entire lives look trivial by comparison. The Swarmlord hungered in a way that admitted no satisfaction, no moment of relief, no completion. It simply drove forward the biological imperative of a species that had been feeding and never finding enough for as long as the concept of enough had existed in any universe it had inhabited. And something in Dante, old and experienced and exhausted as he was, recognized that as a kind of suffering he had not anticipated. The duel was brutal in a way that the word barely captures. Dante burned one of the Swarmlord's arms away with a point-blank weapon discharge, while he broke one of its bone swords, actually broke one of those ancient crystal-cored blades. He drove a weapon through one of its eyes. The Swarmlord responded by battering through his armor with psychic attacks, and then driving the shattered remnant of its broken bone sword through his chest, piercing his secondary heart, and leaving the blade lodged in him alongside a poison that would have killed him on any other day. What saved Dante and ended the Swarmlord was the moment of opportunity created by the lodged blade. The armor sealant foams in his suit bonded around the weapon, fixing it in place, and the fixing of it in place fixed the Swarmlord's arm in place too. With the creature locked into close contact by its own weapon, Dante raised the perdition pistol and fired it into the Swarmlord's face at a range that made the resulting melter beam categorically unresistible. The Swarmlord's head was destroyed. Dante collapsed. He died, or he very nearly died. The accounts are careful here, because what followed belongs to the stranger territory of Blood Angel's lore and the nature of Sanguinius's legacy. He was brought back, through an experience that he described as a vision of his Primarch, and he woke to find that Reboot Guilliman and the Indomitus Crusade had arrived in the system. The Primarch's fleet swept through the remaining Tyranid forces, and Baal was saved, at enormous cost, with the chapter's future badly wounded by the loss of the neophytes, with the planet's surface ravaged and its moon stripped, but saved. The Swarmlord was dead, and somewhere in the biological processing capacity of the hive mind, a new body was being prepared, carrying everything that Baal had taught it. The weakness of the trapped blade, the exact sequence that Dante had used to create the point-blank opportunity, the specific psychological profile of a 1,000-year-old chapter master who would sacrifice himself without hesitation if the sacrifice was necessary. All of it, catalogued, integrated, available to the next iteration. The implications of what the Swarmlord is, and of the mechanism by which it learns and grows, are something that the Imperium of Man has never been in a position to think through publicly, because thinking through them honestly leads to conclusions that are not conducive to the maintenance of the morale required to fight a war of this scale. Yet each time the Swarmlord is killed, it becomes marginally harder to kill in exactly the same way. Each time it dies, the database of countered approaches grows slightly larger. The window of genuinely novel tactics, things the Swarmlord has never encountered in any form, across millions of years of continuous warfare across multiple galaxies, narrows. And as this happens, the mathematical probability of any given engagement producing the kind of desperate, inspired, deeply improvised solution that has brought the Swarmlord down on the occasions it has been brought down becomes incrementally smaller. Not because the heroes get worse, but because the Swarmlord, in its quiet and patient way, gets harder. The question that some Ordo-Xenos theorists have posed, always in private and always with careful attention to who else is in the room, that is where this trajectory ends. Given sufficient time, and the Great Devourer has demonstrated a willingness to operate on timescales that make Imperial strategic planning look like very short-term thinking, does the Swarmlord become effectively undefeatable in the narrow sense of the word? Does the accumulated library of countered approaches eventually become comprehensive enough that no genuinely novel tactic remains available to any conceivable opponent? The mathematically honest answer to this question, if you apply the underlying logic without the comfort of assuming something will intervene before it becomes relevant, is that this is not impossible. It may already be approaching something like that threshold in specific tactical domains. Against certain types of opponent, using certain types of approach, yet the Swarmlord may already be functionally impossible to defeat through conventional means. The Inquisition does not publish this line of reasoning, but that it exists in the private correspondence and sealed memoranda of the Ordo Xenos tells you something about how seriously the most careful thinkers within the Imperium take what the Swarmlord actually represents as a long-term strategic problem. It survived Macragge, officially listed as destroyed, no body found. It survived Ichar IV, defeated, absorbed, reborn stronger. It survived its appearance at Colovan, where Chaplain Ortan Cassius of the Ultramarines met it in the field and brought it down, only to watch it be resurrected aboard a hive ship in orbit. It survived Baal, destroyed by Dante at the cost of Dante's own life, very nearly, but reborn with the knowledge of what Dante did and how he did it. It appeared at Sanctum, in what is now the era of the Dark Imperium, leading a Leviathan horde, and when that assault was driven back by Imperial forces, the Swarmlord went missing. Not dead, missing, unaccounted for, which is, depending on your frame of mind, either reassuring or the most alarming possible outcome. Missing means it is still out there, thinking, accumulating, preparing for whatever the hive mind determines its next necessary deployment to be. There is a final dimension to the Swarmlord that we have not fully addressed yet, and it is worth spending time with before we close, because it changes the emotional texture of how you understand everything we have discussed. The Swarmlord is extraordinarily intelligent. It is experienced beyond any meaningful comparison. One, it is tactically sophisticated in a way that challenges every other strategist the galaxy has produced, and it is entirely, completely, at the service of something that does not want anything beyond more. The hive mind's hunger is not a strategic objective in the way that an empire's desire for territory or resources is a strategic objective. It is not something that can be satisfied, negotiated around, or redirected. It is the fundamental nature of the entity expressing itself through every action the swarm takes, and the Swarmlord, for all its individual seeming intelligence, exists in service of that hunger and nothing else. Dante saw this when he looked into the Swarmlord's eyes at Baal. He pitied it, the lore tells us, because the hunger in those eyes made even the red thirst, the Blood Angel's own terrible and consuming spiritual curse, trivial by comparison. There is something in that observation worth sitting with. The Swarmlord carries within it millions of years of experience, the accumulated lessons of uncountable engagements, a strategic sophistication that exceeds anything any mortal commander can claim. And all of that intelligence, all of that extraordinary capability, exists in service of a need so fundamental and so complete that it does not leave room for anything else. The Swarmlord does not appreciate the worlds it consumes. It does not experience satisfaction at a well-executed campaign. It does not feel anything that maps onto the emotions we associate with great accomplishment. And because the hive mind that it serves has no capacity for satisfaction, it only has the drive to consume more. This is the horror of the Great Devourer that is different from the horror of chaos, different from the horror of human evil, different from any other threat the galaxy contains. Chaos corrupts, which implies that corruption can be resisted. The dark gods pursue specific and comprehensible goals, which implies that understanding their goals opens possibilities for opposition. The Tyranids, the Swarmlord, simply hunger. There is no conversation to be had. There is no common ground to be found. The things that give life in the Milky Way galaxy, its meaning and its value, its cultures and its histories, and its art and its warfare, and its faith and its love and its fear, all of these register to the hive mind, and by extension to the Swarmlord, purely as measures of how much biomass a given population or planet represents. Nothing else. This is what makes facing the Swarmlord something different from facing any other opponent. You are not fighting against something that wants to defeat you in the way that any competitor or enemy wants to defeat you. You are fighting against the impersonal, ancient, patient hunger of a species that has been at this for millions of years, that has consumed everything it has encountered without exception, and that will continue to consume until either everything that can be consumed has been consumed, or something stops it that nothing has ever been capable of stopping before. And yet, the Swarmlord has been killed, multiple times, by mortals who should not have been capable of it, yet who succeeded, not because the mathematics favored them, but because they refused, in the specific, desperate moment that mattered, to accept the outcome the mathematics were suggesting. Calgar on Ichar IV, Dante on Baal, Ortan Cassius on Colovan. These are not small achievements. They are not easy victories, but they happened. And each one of them demonstrates the thing that the Swarmlord's accumulated strategic database, however vast and however comprehensive, cannot fully account for. The capacity of an individual to exceed what any model of their capabilities would predict, in the precise moment when everything depends on it. The hive mind is intelligent. The Swarmlord is intelligent. But their intelligence is in service of a logic that is, at its root, biological and mechanistic. Consume, survive, grow, adapt. So these axioms account for a great deal of what any opponent will do. But they cannot fully account for the individual who looks at impossible odds and decides, not through calculation, but through something much older than calculation, that they will try anyway. The decision that Aloysius made at Cold Steel Ridge to hold the Swarmlord with his body and his will so that the gunships could extract Calgar. The decision that the crew of the Dominus Astra made to drive their ship into the heart of the Tyranid fleet and detonate its warp drives. The decision that Dante made to fight through an ocean of organisms toward the one thing that might change the outcome, knowing that he probably would not survive the attempt. These decisions belong to a category that the Swarmlord's analytical intelligence struggles with, but not because they are irrational. In context, all three of them were arguably the most rational choice available, but because they emerge from a quality of commitment that biological calculus does not easily model. A commitment to something other than individual survival, expressed in the moment of action with a clarity and a completeness that defeats the assumptions of any opponent who believed that survival instinct would eventually produce a more conservative outcome. The Imperium will face the Swarmlord again. This is not a possibility to be planned around. It is a certainty to be accepted. The Swarmlord will return, because it always returns, because the hive mind never stops, because the hunger that drives it cannot be satiated by any number of defeats. It will return stronger, incorporating the lessons of every previous death. And somewhere in the Imperium, on a world or in a void battle that we cannot yet identify, there is a person, or perhaps several people in several places, who will be the next link in the chain that connects Aloysius and Calgar and Dante to whatever comes after. Who will face the Swarmlord across whatever field of battle the hive mind has chosen for the next engagement, and who will have to find, in the desperate and specific moment that demands it, something the Swarmlord has not yet fully accounted for. The great devourer is patient. So are we. And the one thing that patience cannot predict is the person who decides that patience is not enough and acts. We have covered, in the course of this journey, the full scope of what the Swarmlord is, what it has done, and what it represents in the broader context of the war that never quite ends at the edges of the Milky Way galaxy. From the strangeness of its existence as the hive mind's emergency resource and the philosophical implications of a mind that grows stronger through death, through the specific battles that mark the checkpoints of its known history in this galaxy. Macragge and the terrible cost paid by the Ultramarines' first company. The Tau at Viorelos, discovering that orbital superiority is not the same as safety. Kalga's revenge at Ichar IV, the Holder sector consumed in 4 months. Baal and the duel that nearly killed a chapter master who had been killing the hive mind's best for over 1,000 years. To the ongoing reality of a threat that does not end, does not rest, and does not forget. The Swarmlord is, and by any reasonable measure, the most dangerous individual organism that the Tyranid hive mind has produced in the galaxy's recorded history. It is ancient beyond any comfortable reckoning, intelligent beyond any reassuring comparison, and motivated by something so fundamental and so complete that no argument or appeal or alternative offers even the beginning of a lever to work with. It carries within it the lessons of civilizations that no longer exist, and battles that happened in galaxies too far away for any light from them to have reached us yet. And it is somewhere in the dark, between stars, right now, patient and hungry, waiting for the moment the hive mind determines it is needed again. If you have spent this time with me and found it as fascinating as I find it, and the Swarmlord genuinely is one of the most philosophically interesting threats in all of Warhammer 40,000, an entity that challenges some of the most fundamental assumptions we make about intelligence and capability, and what it means to face something that learns from being beaten, then please do consider leaving a like on this video. It genuinely makes a difference to how these longer explorations reach people, and it lets me know that the depth is something you want more of rather than less. If you are not already part of the Q on 40K channel, the subscribe button is right there waiting for you, and I promise there is a great deal more to explore. Every hive fleet carries its own story. Every major campaign in the Tyrannic Wars has layers we have not touched. And the broader question of what the Tyranids are running from, because yes, the evidence suggests they may be running from something somewhere in the void beyond our galaxy, is a mystery that deserves its own long, careful, unhurried journey. Take care of yourselves, stay warm, and remember that whatever weight your day has brought with it, you are navigating it with the full complexity of an individual consciousness, which is something that the most powerful predator the universe has ever produced cannot fully account for. That might just be enough.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.